for CE. The topic of today's discussion is a topical one, the UNFCCC's Global Stocktake, and exactly what journalists need to take stock of. And we could not have a more fitting and qualified guest on today's program than Carlon Mendoza, Climate Policy Advisor, Climate Justice at Climate Analytics Caribbean. Now, Carlon is an attorney at law and legal consultant called to the bar in Trinidad and Tobago, and beautiful believes and supports the work of the climate diplomacy team at Climate Analytics as Climate Policy Advisor. Climate justice. His work currently focuses on climate change law and policy, which is important, disaster law and disaster risk reduction in the Commonwealth Caribbean legal imagination. Carlon is a graduate of the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, the University of Reading's International Law with Development Program, as well as a Chevening Scholar alumni, which is cool. Welcome, Carlon, and thank you again for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours with your presentation.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for having me on to discuss, as you said, a topical conversation, which is the Global Stocktake. So I don't have a presentation of sorts prepared because it's, I assume, the hangout or conversation that we're going to have this morning. So I'll just break it down by starting off as what is this UNFCCC process for those who may not be familiar with it on the call, but it's simply that is called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it's the UN body that is responsible for climate change. And under that convention, that framework, there are what we call in international law treaties or agreements, which is what parties would reach, parties being countries would reach by consensus, certain provisions or principles that they would decide on and agree. And under that UNFCCC, there are three major documents, what we call treaties, what we call protocols or agreements. And the first one is the United Nations Convention itself, which was adopted in 1992. And then from that, we have the Kyoto Protocol and further the Paris Agreement, which most persons would be familiar with. And all three conventions, protocols, treaties, whatever you want to call it, are agreements stipulated or contracts entered into by countries. And the aim of all three contracts collectively is to reduce the global greenhouse gas emissions. And all of them take different formats or different perspectives of what types of goals, what types of principles will be applied, what is the main focus of certain of these agreements. And for the conversation today specifically, we'll be focusing on the Paris Agreement, which was adopted in 2015. And in that agreement, the major objective of that agreement is to limit the global average temperature to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And what that simply means is that pre-industrial time, the average global temperature in that century was a number, I think it was 13.9 degrees, don't quote me on it, but there's average temperature there. And what this agreement is attempting to do is limit in this century an increase of that global average to keep it below 1.5. And so you always hear this statement or the phrase 1.5 degrees Celsius to stay alive. And that is something, that is where that is rooted. And from that agreement, we have other goals on mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage or means of implementation, simply meaning technology, support, finance, capacity building, and all other factors or goals that we would want to use or utilize to achieve that overall global average temperature goal of 1.5. And simply put, for today's discussion, Article 14 of that Paris Agreement is where we talk about the global stocktake. And that simply is a process whereby the parties or countries will now come together every 5 years, and this is the first cycle of this global stocktake, to assess their collective progress with respect to this temperature goal and other goals, as I just listed, mitigation, adaptation, or the other thematic areas. So it would come to one, as the name says, take stock of what has been done and what needs to be done. And this is further aimed to influence what we call our nationally determined contributions. It's commitments made by the countries as to their efforts in relation to this goal or the 1.5 goal and other goals. So Article 14 is a process called the Global Stocktake. And within that process, we have three phases that we went through for the last 3 years. And the first phase is the collection of information and data and research. So it was a time where the Secretariat of the UNFCCC and the countries were able to make submissions, do research as to exactly what is happening along these thematic areas. What are countries doing with respect to adaptation strategies or action? What are they doing with respect to mitigation? How is capacity building going in developing countries? Is finance flowing to developing countries? And that was that first phase of that data collection, and that was done through submissions. So there was a portal online where persons were able to write in terms of whether it be countries, whether it be NGOs. So what we'll say in this terminology, I try to stay away from the jargon because it's a conversation we're having, but what we would say is parties and non-party stakeholders. Non-party stakeholders would be NGOs, academic groups, trade unions, all the other entities outside of independent countries belonging to the UN system. So they were able to make submissions into this portal to say exactly what is being done, what is needed, what is required, what more could be done. So when that phase was finished, we started the technical phase. And the technical phase was one which saw a varying number of activities throughout COP into the subsidiary body meetings that are usually held every year in Bonn, Germany, as well as the other COP. So there were 3 technical phases, or technical dialogues as it was called. And the technical dialogues comprised of activities such as roundtable discussions, such as World Cafe. This was a new innovative way of collecting information from parties and non-party stakeholders, as well as focused exchanges. And this was something new to the negotiation realm. Instead of just going and looking at documents and fighting over words and lines of text, this was something where we saw an engagement or lively discussions of certain things. So the technical dialogue were divided into like different categories. So the first one was, what is the issue? What is the problem? And the parties were allowed to express their problems, the issues that they're facing. They were able to express that there's a lack of finance flows. They were able to express that adaptation is being severely outweighed by mitigation, action, or effort. And in that, people are focusing more on mitigation rather than adaptation. Because again, for Caribbean SIDS, or like us, ourselves, adaptation is what we particularly need to focus on, because we are not large emitters. So mitigation action, whilst yes, we can contribute it, it's not something that is high in priority. So in that instance, that was the first technical dialogue. The second one was, how do you want to solve this issue? What are the things or the activities or the actions that have been successfully implemented in certain countries, developed and developing, that are good examples of adaptation strategies, of mitigation strategies, of capacity building, of finance? What are some good examples? So it moved away from lamenting and crying on what the issue is, but to saying, okay, this is a solution that you can implement. And the final dialogue, technical dialogue, which happened this year in June, dealt with what's next. How are we now going to take the how and the why and make it into what's next. What are we going to do with this information? And out of the three technical dialogues, there was a report that was produced called the Technical Dialogue Summary Report, which is available online on the UNFCCC website for anybody to have a read, which kind of verbatim goes through the contributions, the feedback, the comments made by persons involved in the process. And out of those three, that phase, we moved into the third phase, which is now the consideration of the outputs, or the political phase, which is happening at COP28 in Dubai. And in that phase, so we started that phase at the end of the Bonn session, which sought to move now all this technical information into what we really go to COP for the political decisions made by ministers and negotiators on how are we going to really take stock and increase our ambition so that we achieve the long-term temperature goal. And in that, it was noted that we have to know that what is the structure of this decision, the consideration of the output, how we going to utilize the decision, and therefore now take stock of exactly what is happening so that it could influence the NDCs of countries, and then it could also increase action. So in a nutshell, that is what the Global Stocktake is.
Thank you so much for that, Carlon. Okay, so as Carlon had mentioned, this is a discussion. So guys, ask any question you want to know about. Remember this, we have an expert here in policy and the stock take. So just ask any question you want. Does anyone have a question at the moment or comment for Mr. Carlon? You can go ahead, Aliyah.
Thank you, Hippolito. Hi, Carlon. Thanks so much for being here. So the question that I have pertains to not necessarily the UNFCCC, but just Caribbean collaboration in general. So I'm just wondering if you know about any collaborative projects or groups that Caribbean islands are currently working on to kind of push that adaptation and mitigation process.
Yeah. Thanks for the question, Aliyah. So as part of this entire process, Climate Analytics Caribbean engaged in a GST sensitization campaign over the last year, since January to now, and it's ongoing. And part of that process, which I had the pleasant opportunity to be part of, had to deal with exactly that, examining what are some of the positive actions or positive steps that are being taken by Caribbean SIDS with respect to adaptation issues, with respect to capacity building. And we have launched a documentary. It's being edited at the moment, so we already did the filming part, and it's carded to be released at COP28. But what I can give you a snippet of, because we have posted on our social media about some of the persons we interviewed and the groups we interviewed. So I can say for Dominica, we visited the Kalinago territory. And within that territory, we learned about their indigenous actions and indigenous way of life, which aids in adaptation strategies. Particularly, Dominica was such a unique experience because of what they went through with Hurricane Maria, and the ability of the indigenous people to survive based on practices that are rooted in nature, and what we would refer to in this space as ecosystem-based adaptation. So in this way of utilizing your ecosystem and what is available, it is something that we as a wider scale Caribbean, so that's the focus of the documentary, to highlight these activities or strategies or implementation activities that certain territories or communities use and utilize so that we could replicate it on a larger scale. Similarly, we visited St. Lucia, where we visited a youth group, I can't remember the name now, in Choiseul, that's southern part of the island, which two young persons came up with rainwater harvesting to sustain their community because of the lack of pipe-borne water to the community. And those are activities rooted in environmental action, or also rooted in adaptation. It is how we adapt to the impacts of climate change. What are the things that we can utilize and the resources we can utilize, or the innovation that can be created to assist us in this adaptation mechanism? So that is just two examples, and I could safely say that it was something that was really noteworthy and would be further explained or shown in our documentary. Yes?
Yeah, so
Thank
before I
you.
go ahead with Aliyah, do you have a follow-up?
I do. Sorry.
Yeah, so before you go ahead, is it okay if you put on your camera? And for others who also want to ask a question, you can put your question in the chat and I'll ask it for you. But you can go ahead, Aliyah.
Yeah. So you mentioned the going on to COP28, and I just wanted to know if there are any projects, I guess, or initiatives that we should be looking out for as a follow-up at COP28. Things that were discussed at COP27 or proposed that we should know about as the Caribbean community.
Yeah. Thanks for that question, and I know that was obviously one of the takeaways from the discussion. And what I would say is that what you have as journalists need to look forward, or just persons in general that need to look forward with respect to the Global Stocktake and COP28, is that this is a process whereby it is supposed to assess collective action. And what we need to look out for is the stories on how countries are responding to the climate crisis and the urgency that is being placed on activities to assist the developing country, particularly in relation to loss and damage and finance. So what we need to look forward to or look out for is the ways in which the decisions are being taken with respect to loss and damage, funding for loss and damage, funding for adaptation strategies, and those sort of decisions or partnerships or meetings that would be brokered during COP that would facilitate or aid. So a perfect example of this in COP27, we heard about the Bridgetown Initiative. And we heard about what it's going to be and the announcement made by the Prime Minister of Barbados. What we have to look forward to in COP28 is whether that is going to be materialized. How is it going to be materialized? You know, with respect to the loss and damage fund that was declared in COP27, what we want to look forward to is how is that going to be operationalized? The decisions being taken around the funding, decisions being taken around the $100 billion goal, finance goal, the decisions around what is the global goal for adaptation. There must be some global target that countries need to meet. So those are some of the activities generally. I can't say specifically what exactly to look out for, but I can give you the key hints of the thematic areas where you need to put focus on in terms of how is that going to impact Caribbean SIDS in particular.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question, Aliyah. Any other questions from anyone? You can go ahead, Chriselle.
Carlin, you mentioned that we are to be looking at how the countries are implementing their national plans and whatnot. And I want to ask your professional opinion. How are we doing with that?
Good question. I would have to err on the side of caution, especially in responding with respect to political, because it is a political process. And let's be honest, what occurs in the international space in COP, because it's a multinational process where parties or countries are agreeing, but in what we call in law, there is that area of where we speak about things on the international level, but then it doesn't have application because of our legal system. It doesn't have application within our local territories and countries. And I would say professionally, more needs to be done with respect to that translation from the international to the national. there must be forthright policies, implementation plans on particular key issues, such as, let's say, for example, the just transition. And that is simply where we know what the goal is, we know what adaptation is, we know exactly where we want to go and what is happening. But where we want to go and how we're going to get there, two different things. And how we're going to get there needs a plan, it needs a strategy, it needs law, it needs a framework. And I think focus needs to be placed on the strategy, the framework. And I think parties, as particularly countries in the Caribbean, need to do a little more. But I could give an example. I could say particularly for Trinidad and Tobago, there has been a push in the just transition direction with respect to an implementation plan that has been prepared by the government. And that implementation plan has to deal with a roadmap to a just transition, which is a start, which is what we need. I could also say in my professional experience in St. Lucia, there is also talks or considerations of implementing climate change legislation. So legislation that comes from the prepared, or was prepared by the Sustainable Development Unit in St. Lucia. But again, it can be prepared, but then it's a political decision that needs to be taken to cabinet, that needs to go through the process, and most of us will be familiar with those sort of activities that carry us to that level. So professionally speaking, more could be done, and further commitments need to be taken by all countries, especially in the Caribbean. So no matter how small we are, no matter if we feel that we are not necessarily major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, there are other things or other spin-off effects that would hamper us if we don't have the right framework in place.
Thank you so much for that question, Crystal. Do we have any other persons who have questions? Pardon, one of the questions I have then would be, what is the role that the private sector and businesses play in this entire process?
That's an excellent question, because actually this is the first, one of the few of first opportunities where private sector and non-party stakeholders, as I indicated before, that we call them, we categorize as non-party stakeholders, was actually allowed to be in negotiation room or spaces. Because if you're familiar with COP and the processes, persons who hold only representative of the parties or the countries are allowed to enter into those rooms and participate in the activities that would further any work under the Paris Agreement. And in this particular occasion, the Global Stocktake opened up that door for the participation of private sector, for the participation of trade unions, for the participation of NGOs, business. And it was a welcoming and I would say eye-opening experience, because again, when you have negotiators in a space, it's kind of geared towards a political outcome and a decision. But when you have the private sector involved, or you have NGOs involved, you get that sort of emotive understanding of exactly what the situation is and how persons feel on the ground. So civil society is given an opportunity to speak and voice their concerns, voice their solutions within the process. So within this particular Global Stocktake process, there was inclusivity all around.
Thank you so much for that, Caron. And guys, I encourage you to put on your cameras so we can see your lovely faces. And Vishani, you have a question, you can go ahead.
Hey, hello everyone. I have two questions. My first is, I'm trying to wrap my head around, how do you really guarantee that whatever information the countries present, like their NDCs, for example, how do you guarantee that that's actually true and that's not just what they're saying? And to follow up on the question on private sector players, I've been reading a bit about the global stocktake. And in the same way countries would submit NDCs, how would you account for what companies, like I'm thinking like oil companies, how would you account for what they're doing or not doing?
All right, to answer your question, with respect to the accuracy of the information that would be submitted in the NDCs, if that's in the question, and how do we know what countries are saying? The NDCs is formally a document that countries, as I said, would say what are their targets, what are their goals with respect to the Paris Agreement. And it's aspirational in nature. So it is something that countries aspire to. Under the Paris Agreement and the framework, we have a kind of separation into developing and developed countries. And certain commitments or certain commitments made by developed countries and developing countries are what we'll say either binding or non-binding. So one will be held accountable. Developed countries will be held accountable for certain commitments being made. Developing countries will be treated as aspirational because of the fact that they are developing and the fact that we are already slightly hampered in the process in terms of capacity, in terms of financing. So equity is a major player with respect to that. So the commitments are aspirational in nature, one. So what a country puts on their NDCs are expected to be within their contextual circumstances. It is expected that with their finances, with the capacity, with the intended support that is to be received, this is exactly what they're going to do. Developed countries can say the same. And I can give you an example from a legal background. The UK has actually, their companies has actually, not companies, sorry, persons have actually sued the UK government with respect to stating that their NDCs weren't ambitious enough. And that is a case that actually occurred within the UK legal system because of the fact that as a developed country, they are held to a higher standard. So that is where accountability comes in within respect to that first question. Your second question with respect to parties and businesses being, or oil companies being held accountable, the process doesn't necessarily distinguish between whether it's an oil company or a business or certain that type of direct sort of demarcation of what exactly or who exactly is contributing or giving a submission. What I can say is oil companies have their own, and I'm not a oil and gas expert, but oil companies have their own mandates and they need to do what is right, especially when it comes to the phasing out and down of fossil fuel exploration. So that aside, the general landscape of this global stocktake is that it is important that all action taken by parties and non-party stakeholders, including oil companies, need to be in such an increased manner so that the 1.5 temperature goal is achieved in this century. This is the first global stocktake, and it is imperative on all involved, oil companies included, to know that their actions or activities that contribute to greenhouse gases needs to be cut. And we can only hope that COP28 and future delivers on strong language or commitments or actual action with respect to that fossil fuel phase down and phase out. So I can't answer in terms of exactly the accountability within the submission process, but generally speaking, that is what needs to occur. I hope that answers your question.
Just a quick follow-up on the private sector side of things. I'm really curious to know, is there a way that they too make formal submissions that you can account for in the global stocktake? Like in the same way countries have NDCs, do they have submissions, aspirational goals or whatever to account for what they are doing to try to limit global warming, for example, or anything of the sort?
No, not in this process, because even though contributions or submissions were allowed from non-party stakeholders and private sector, it was taken into account in the synthesis process or the technical process that I spoke about earlier. It was taken into account in terms of what could be done, how we could, because there are a number of activities or actions that can be learned from private sector. Let's be honest, sometimes private sector is better than public sector, or makes stronger strides in terms of action. However, when it comes to actual commitments, the Paris Agreement only accommodates the commitments of parties and countries in this process. So there is no sort of mechanism within that system. However, I don't know if you're following news. There recently was a group of young persons who took a company to court, or took a country to court with respect to climate change. And Shell, BP, all of those large oil companies and private sector has been taken to court numerous occasions, especially in the EU, with respect to their commitments and their actions. So it is not a process that is rooted inside the UNFCCC process, but it's something that the legal system, wherever a country is based, could be utilized in that instance to hold them accountable.
And Carlin, what's your position on offsets, carbon offsets? Because some companies would then carry out like clean causes and clean activities, green activities, just that they offset their carbon emissions. What's your thought on that? Because some people think like, okay, so you're still doing it, even though you're doing clean activities, but you're still causing damage to the environment.
I think I would again err on the side of caution, because I am not an offset expert or carbon markets expert, but I could speak from a legal and justice point of view with respect to your question. And I think that there are always exceptions to any law. And there are always, there's an exception to a rule. And you have to now weigh the gravity of the situation in terms of what do these offset means, or what does this contract or this provision, what are the implications of that provision, and whether or not it minimizes the problem or it just placates the situation and gives a blanket effect to say that we are doing work, we are offsetting, or we are using different strategies, carbon capture and credits and all these things to minimize the impact, but really and truly, what is the impact on the long-term temperature goal? And that's my professional take in terms of we need to assess whether these strategies are okay, or whether they are, how to put it, whether they do not affect the long-term temperature goal in such a way that if we do not have those strategies, then therefore the long-term temperature goal will not go above 1.5. So it is a question of scale, and it's a question of measuring exactly the implications of such activities. I'm not an expert in that, so I will leave that for the scientists and other persons involved in that sort of activity to give that professional guidance there. But that's my take in terms of justice. Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you. And then your position on moral guilt and legal guilt, because there was a discussion in Belize. The company is right within its right to carry out its activity on paper. The legislation allows it to do so, but morally, it shouldn't have done so. What's your take on legal guilt and moral guilt?
That's a difficult question for a lawyer. Because if it's written in the law, and there is the company is found not to be in breach of the particular law, then that is the be all and end all of the matter. But again, climate change and climate justice expands further from legal norms and legal principles being applied to justice and equity principles being applied. and justice and equity form part of the moral landscape of what a person would think is right. So there is, as much as I say, yes, it's a legal, it's like if you're right in law, you're right. But there's also a part of law that deals with equity. And there's a saying that we learned years ago in school that says, he who comes to the court with clean hands, you must come to the court with clean hands. And in the sense, that's simply saying that your hands or your actions must be morally right or clean in order for you to want to have a benefit or a right, and in order to share in the process. So again, it's a matter of scale. And again, I would just simply say that in climate change and in climate justice, equity will prevail. So it is something that, even though it might be legally right, the question of equity, the question of whether no one is being left behind, vulnerable communities are not being affected, even though it is right, or whether there are some undertakings that are not morally right. So that's how I would deal with that situation.
Thank you for that, Carlon. I have a question in the chat, and the question reads, what are the practical next steps after the Global Stocktake?
All right. Thanks for that question. So the next steps is actually right upcoming here at COP28. And that has to deal with, as I said, the consideration of the output. So now we have all this technical information, and we know that we wanted to inform the nationally determined contributions of parties. So the next steps is, how are we going to take all this information that was collated over the last 3 years and synthesize it, or make it something that is transferable and politically binding on parties? And that is the question that will be addressed in COP28. Whether it is going to be a political declaration of sorts, that they declare that this is what needs to be done with respect to the temperature goals, adaptation, mitigation, means of implementation, or whether it's going to be a political decision that is being taken with respect to, we decide that this is what needs to be done in relation to these thematic areas. Outside of that, the next step is, now with this technical information, are we going to have a technical annex of sort, a toolkit, a sort of rule book or playbook whereby parties now can take that information and how to translate it into their NDCs? What we need to remember, again, as I stated earlier, is that in this process, it is a process by consensus, and it is a process that is binding on some and not binding on others. And you really can't, again, and also in this process, because it's being done at a multinational, international level, the decisions being taken there sometimes may not redound into our domestic legislation. And the NDCs are sort of a flip of both. NDCs are for the international process, but influences domestic policies and framework and strategies of a country. So the question now is taking that technical information into a format of a technical annex or a toolkit, and now channeling that through to the NDCs, to policy, to legislation. So hopefully, so I can say from a SIDS perspective, that is what we hope to see. We hope to see that translation. We've learned so much in this technical dialogue. Now, what we've learned, we need to channel it into action, because this is now the time, even though this process is going to happen 5 years again, and then the NDC process is going to happen again, this is the first one, and now is the time to actually stay on track for that long-term temperature goal.
Thank you very much for that, Carlon. Now, in one of the Republican U.S. presidential debate, one of the presidential candidate for the Republican Party, he had mentioned that climate change doesn't kill people. It's poor climate change policies that kill people. What do you think about that statement? I ask because the U.S. is a major role in how we fight climate change?
Again, rooting my response from my professional capacity, I am a firm believer that policy is something that is extremely important and is something that guides action and guides activity. Rules guide activity, laws guide activity, guides responses and measures what needs to be done or what has to be done, and if there's a breach, who is liable and are held accountable. Yes, climate change has not evolved into that aspect as strong as criminal law. And the statement that climate change doesn't kill people but are the policies is absolutely correct, because if it is that there are policies in place to deal with greenhouse gases, and there are policies in place to deal with oil exploration, oil and gas exploration, then we would not be in this position. The IPCC has stated that it is human activity within the last century, that has caused the rapid escalating change in temperature. It's stated by scientists. I'm not a scientist, but I believe the evidence that has been presented in the numerous assessment cycles from the IPCC. And it's similar, going back to my experience in disaster law. There is a saying that there is nothing such as a natural disaster. And the reason for that is, it is because that if you know that this particular area is prone to earthquakes, and it's in the tectonic plates, my little geography, the tectonic plates are converging, and that's an area that is prone for disasters, but you proceed to build hotels and buildings in that area that is not regulated by policy, then therefore that is not a natural disaster. It is a disaster that you caused. It is a disaster that was waiting to happen because of the fact that there was no regulations or policy in place. So akin to that statement, that's how I personally feel.
Thank you so much, Carlin. We have a question from Crystal. You can go ahead, Crystal.
Okay, I feel like this has nothing to do with the stock take whatsoever, but based on Hippolyto's last question and the fact that you're into climate justice, I just have to ask, what is your take on some of the actions that are being taken by climate change activists, such as throwing the pink paint on artwork? And I read a story, I think just last week, about people cementing their hand in the ground. And then we have Fridays for the Future. What's your take on those kind of activities?
Again, I feel like
I feel like we're not doing a global stock take thing.
No, we are there. What I was going to say is, I feel as if I have been thrown into the fire by a bunch of hard-hitting journalists asking these questions and taking me for a loop. But I would say that activism is one way of getting your message across. Is it the only way? It may not be. Is it something that persons that may get one significant more highlight or attention and bring spread the spotlight or point the spotlight on the issue? Yes. But is it something that may actually influence change and actually be there, like in terms of having decision makers pay attention and take these steps? I think it's a start. I'm not radical. I don't think I know we in the Caribbean, we like to burn tires and protest, and that's how we are heard. And it's needed. Trust me, it's needed. I'm not saying not to do it. But I think activism needs to be backed up by practicality, and it needs to be backed up by persons or young persons. I'm an advocate for, hopefully I'm young myself, but I'm an advocate for persons who are young and they have the ideas. They are the future generation. They know exactly what is happening. They are the ones who are going to feel the impact in their 40s, 50s, if we don't take action now, and if we don't implement some of these strategies or the innovative ideas for adaptation, for mitigation, for means of implementation, if they don't, so you see, I'm bringing it back to the stock take. If they don't implement these actions now, or we don't increase these activities, all the activism would be null and void, in my opinion.
Thank you so much for that. Carolyn, one of the things that we do at Climate Trackers when it comes to our climate justice fellowship, because we work with reporters, some of them here across the Caribbean, is to give a voice to the voiceless, especially vulnerable communities, indigenous people, women and children, what have you. So in terms of that, how can these vulnerable communities, including the differently able, ensure that their voices are heard in these discussions, especially when it comes to the Global Stocktake process?
Right. Excellent question. I think I'm part of another working group that actually addresses how to increase civil society voice within the process. And civil society voice, yes, we use that term loosely, but civil society voice means exactly the vulnerable, the elderly, women and children, persons who are usually not a part of the process. And I think one of the findings is that there are ways, because not everyone will have a seat at the table. Let's be honest about that. Not everyone will have a seat at the table, but there are ways to get yourself to the table through other groups or larger entities. And as part of the Climate Justice Alliance that was formed by Canary, was one of the ways in which I saw within the Caribbean space a number of other another number of other groups, activists, gender groups, vulnerable community groups. I worked in the Just Transition group, which dealt with like laborers and academics and persons actually having a voice and communicating their priorities within that process, and then thereby the alliance itself taking up the entire collective response and submitting it into the process, or going to these activities, because not everyone will be able to reach a COP or to reach on a webinar or to reach anywhere that might be heard, but they are able to channel that information into a group that is going there. And I think it goes two ways, so that groups like Climate Tracker should also reach out to the vulnerable community. I could say Climate Alex Caribbean, selfish plug, has reached out in a number of projects, because one of our first projects that I worked on within the climate justice space outside of the Alliance was an activity in terms of understanding indigenous farming practices in Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, and St. Vincent. And what we learned from that process was that these are vulnerable communities. These are farmers particularly affected by climate change, changing temperatures, lack of rainfall, drought, out of season. There's nothing such as a rainy season or dry season anymore in the Caribbean. So we particularly learned that they had to adapt. And what do they need to adapt further from the government? You know, what sort of policies, what sort of financial flows that is needed in order to create or continue and sustain their livelihood. So it's both ways, and from that we're able to assess and do a report and highlight it. And we hope that the aim of this is to channel the funding that is available globally into these communities and sustain that process for themselves, so that they can take ownership, because that's part of capacity building, taking ownership of something. We don't want developed countries coming in and just doing something and then leaving, but it's about building, it's about long-term growth. So
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Carlin. And before I go to the final question from Crystal, I would like to say that our fellows on both the first cycle and second cycle have done a great job in terms of connecting with vulnerable communities and giving their space, their voice then. But yeah, you can go ahead, Crystal.
So, Carlin, I wanted to ask that question earlier, but I thought no. But you just answered that one and you brought me right back to my question, which relates to education. So we've been speaking about climate change for years. You have the activists, the politicians, everybody is speaking about climate change. But we're still seeing that some people, for whatever reason, maybe do not believe in it. They do not act accordingly. There is no mitigation happening. There is no adaptation happening. While others, of course, are getting into adaptation. I read an article last week about people in South America who get their water from ponds are now choosing not to put salt in their food because their pond water has become so salty. I can't remember which country, but I thought it was quite interesting that they're doing that. So in regards to education, I want to ask, how do we get the message out there? Because we have been saying climate change, but do we need to change the narrative? Which probably is yes, but how? What then do we say?
I think that's a question that we haven't figured out the answer to. I think that, yes, I agree, changing the narrative. And in changing the narrative, it's about breaking down the large acronyms, the words, the jargon, even saying climate change. You brought me to my memory went back even yesterday. Climate Analytics launched a loss and damage project, which is going to account for how we as the Caribbean are going to deal with loss and damage and the funding that is needed in terms of our islands, in terms of the loss of our sea walls. What you just explained is about saltwater salinity. That is where saltwater is coming into our freshwater supplies. And in that instance, instead of using the word climate change or the phrase climate change, it's saying simply crippling heat. That resonates with everyone. It's hot. So it's about using that sort of, because we are humans and we deal on emotions, whether or not you express it or you don't. Those are things that draw us in. And as reporters, you would know persons have that whole 7-day cycle in terms of how long a story lives. But exactly, crippling heat connects to issues such as water scarcity. We don't have any seasons anymore. Things like that, like it's about breaking down what we know as the scientific language of climate change, adaptation, what we know as mitigation, and saying that you can use, when the rain comes, harvest the water, or these are the activities that are being taken by Caribbean countries and certain communities in respect to fighting water scarcity or battling this crippling heat. So I think it's about distilling that information and, as you say, changing the narrative in that aspect. So
thank you very much for that. Okay, so final question. What do reporters need to know when reporting on the Global Stocktake, not only for COP28 at COP28, but for their career?
For the career, I think it's important to know that this is the first opportunity to course correct. It's the first opportunity to get things in line, assess exactly where you are. It's a test, and we all like passing tests. Nobody likes to fail. So we would want to see the best possible grade. And I think what journalists need to look out for, or in this process, is whether countries are achieving an A grade within this process of the UN process, under the Paris Agreement, under all the goals that have been established, whether these goals are being met, and give the remarks, the feedback, what needs to be done. So take countries to task, or take parties to task on their achievements as well as their lack of achievements, and what else could be done.
Thank you so much for that. I feel like time gone fast, but that one good thing. No, good thing, because we were learning a lot. And I appreciate what you shared with us, Carlin. And I think I speak for all of us here that we appreciate you sharing your knowledge and expertise with us in this session. Do you have any final statement?
Not at the moment, but I really did enjoy the conversation. As I said, I almost felt like the president of Guyana being grilled.
Okay, so okay, so before we go, we ask if you can put on your cameras so we can take a group picture to document this fabulous session. Por favor, please. And I think Dezan will be able to take the picture for us.
Yeah, I unfortunately can't put on my video, but I'll take the photo for you guys. So please put on your video. I'll just give you a couple seconds. Hi, Priscilla. Nice to see you. Hi, Johannes. Anybody else able to put on their video? If not, it's fine. But it's always good to have a nice shot. Let me just take. Hi, Bianca. Nice to see you as well. All right. Okay, so I'm gonna take it in 2, 1, 5. Nice, thank you.
Thank
All
you,
right.
everyone. Thank you so much. The session will be uploaded on our YouTube channel, Climate Tracker, and remember to follow us on all of our social media pages. We're on all the major social media pages. Or remember to visit our website, climatetracker.org, and go ahead and subscribe to our newsletter to get updated with everything Climate Tracker. Thank you so much for everyone who joined us today. Thank you very much, Carlin. Everyone, enjoy the rest of the day.